Okay, so let's move into um, the modern period, the 19th century. So as the Reform Judaism becomes more and more popular, um, and Jews begin to, in many ways, assimilate into the larger culture. There is, again, not necessarily a religious movement, but a political based movement. It is a religious and political, let's put it that way. The belief in the need for a homeland, right? The Jews who said, we can't be French anymore, we can't be English anymore, we have to find our own place. It's really interesting if you read the history of 19th century Zionism. Several places were considered, places in Africa, places in North America, but eventually the movement became very much focused on this their original homeland, biblical homeland, that is now referred to as Palestine. So you do see then, starting in the early, around the turn of the century, the beginning of Jews as individuals beginning to move back to Palestine. So this idea of Zionism. The Zionism is the belief in the need for a Jewish homeland. So the idea of Zion being another name for the temple or Jerusalem. So in the Old Testament, in the biblical record. So you've got Jews moving in many different directions in the new open society of Europe, but then we get to what is often considered sort of the watershed event of the role that Jews play in the European society. So this man right here, Alfred Dreyfus, he was a French, so it's all you kind of got to hear. He was a French military officer. Reformed Judaism, following the call of Mendelssohn, he becomes fully assimilated and is a French officer, and he is serving in the military during the Franco-Prussian War. The story goes, so this is, early, 1900 espionage, that someone was passing secrets to the Prussians. Someone finds a piece of paper in Dreyfus's trash can that indicates that's part of this Prussian spy plot, and since it was found in Dreyfus's trash can, that he then is accused of treason. It is, in France, the trial of the century. It makes all the papers, but it is sort of and again, it's a very, very, it's covered, it's big, it's got a lot of press coverage, etc. And he is tried and convicted of treason, and in France that means you're stripped of citizenship and sent and you have to leave France. So he is exiled. However, you have to, the general under whom he served still has to operate with his men, and he's not completely convinced that Dreyfus is the traitor. And so he wants to make double sure that he still doesn't have a traitor in his midst. And unlike the public trial, that just basically sounds like a circus event, the general conducts his own investigation and finds that indeed it was not Dreyfus, it was someone else. And that Dreyfus was basically railroaded because he was Jewish. So that anti-Semitism, no true Frenchman would betray France. It must be that Jew who has loyalty to other things. Go back to the previous slide, we have no homeland but the land of our birth. You have to say that out loud because there are a lot of people who didn't believe it. So again, it became just the indication of how deeply embedded anti-Semitism was in Europe, even in the face of this opening of society in this period. So, of course, he's tried late 1800s. He's granted amnesty in 1899 but he's not allowed to return to France. It takes till 1906 when the court martial is declared erroneous. Basically, he is falsely convicted, and he is allowed to return to France. But it is a really, really big deal in Europe, and just really slashes open the deep, dark underbelly, so to speak. And it is, of course, the precursor event to probably one of the greatest religious persecutions of all times. So they're all aware of the Holocaust. The Germans Hitler starts to take over Germany in the 1930s. The word Holocaust comes from the Bible. It is the name of the whole burnt offering. So there are different kinds of offerings that were given at the temple. Some were burnt completely to ashes. That would be the Holocaust offering. Others were basically cooked and were either eaten as a ritual meal by the priest or the person who offered them. So this idea of being wholly burnt up in an offering to God becomes the name of this horrific event. So about 6 million Jews end up dying because of Hitler and his armies, and it just what more can be said, right? The intensity of the anti-Semitism. It's one thing to railroad Dreyfus into a conviction, false convictions. Another thing to put human beings in trains and basically industrialize death, which is what the Germans did with their death camps and their gas chambers. And I think that question we still need to talk about as human beings in this world is because there have been other Holocausts and huge mass killings of people based on their ethnicity or their religion throughout the 20th century, these ethnic cleansings and everything. And again, it is the on our own moral consciousness as individuals and as a country, why were so many people willing to let this happen? And it's a question we still need to answer for ourselves. But also, if you are specifically Jewish, you've got a situation that now is, the only analogous situation to this is, the destruction of the temple in 587, right? And so in 587 BCE, the Hebrew people decided that this was because they had disobeyed God. They hadn't been following the laws, that if you will be my people, I will be your God. That God had said, you're not adequately following the laws, I will no longer take care of you. And so what happened to us in this moment, they said, was God's will. I don't think that there are many Jews who can make that same move today. And so what is the relationship between the Jewish people and this God? And I think that, remember, I haven't used this term at all in this class, but they considered themselves to be the chosen people. What is it? What is it about being chosen that can lead to something near mass extinction of who you are? So this is really the where Judaism still rests today in a lot of ways. The why question. So as we move on, then, because why spend? It's such a difficult subject, and it's such a difficult thing to think about. The war ends, right? The Allied forces free the camps, and people are no longer able to avoid the knowledge of what the Germans had done. So I think, Palestine the region of Palestine, what we would call the Middle East, uh, and the various Arab princes and leaders had joined with Germany. So they were part of the Axis forces. Many of them sided with Hitler. So when the war ended, uh, Britain took over this region, and it's in what is known as the British Mandate. So the Allied forces, particularly under the British, take over the region of Palestine. And you have then a series of maneuvers which eventually lead to the declaration of the State of Israel. So just a little piece of tidbit of information. If you're talking about the ancient people of the Bible who lived in the nation of Israel, they are Israelites. If you talk about the modern nation of Israel, those are the Israelis. So that's the distinction we make between the ancient nation and the modern nation. So again, I'll skip over the right of return for a second. Many people lived in Palestine, and sort of out of what I would consider European and American guilt over what had happened to the Jews, without intervention on the part of the Allied forces, that to just give over this land to the any Jew who wanted to return, and I think we're still dealing with this issue of there were people there. There were people living in homes who are now in refugee camps living all over the Middle East and Jordan and other places who have keys to homes that as recently as the 1940s and 50s their family lived in. So it is one of the central issues of the politics of that region, and it unfortunately affects all of us. So enough about that. The right of return. Basically, the right of return, you see there were, it's kind of an interesting prospect to start a country with no citizens, actually. So the right of return is the law that was put into place that if you are Jewish, you have the right to return and become a citizen of Israel. So this is how they ended up populating the country with Jews, this right of return. They've slowed that down a bit in the last decade or so. But if you were Jewish, I know this from my own perspective, knowing people in the American context, that many Jews in this, or a certain percentage of Jews in this country, claimed dual citizenship with an Israeli passport and an American passport, or you could just, automatically move to Israel and receive citizenship if you were Jewish. So that is central to the nation of Israel, and also, but it's slowing down. I don't think that they're accepting all Jews quite so freely. So if we then look at Judaism in the modern period, this is not the order in which they developed necessarily, but sort of an order in terms of their scale, right? So we start with the Orthodox. This is the group that fully accepts the Talmud. And so these are the ones that will be keeping kosher, will be keeping strict rules of Sabbath observance, will sometimes actually wear special dress. You will find special shawl cloths underneath their clothes, the yarmulkes, the headdress. And then there are also ultra-Orthodox, and these are the groups that we most often see on the TV, and the Hasidic groups with the which would come under this ultra-Orthodox category with the ringlets, the men with the curls and stuff like that. Reform developed in the 18th century, but so this is not the historical order. The Reform is the one that rejects the Talmud, says Judaism continues to develop, and the ethics of Judaism, rather than the laws and commandments are what it means to be Jews. And they go to temple, they worship, or excuse me, synagogue. They go to synagogue, they continue to worship, but they reject all of this and emphasize this. Conservative is exactly what it sounds like. They are not as strict as the Orthodox, but they are not willing to reject all the laws and commandments yet. So you'll find them keeping kosher and things like that, but perhaps not the special dress, not living in separated communities, etc. So as we move then to the other two, Reconstructionist Judaism is an American denomination of Judaism, which goes even farther than the Talmud. Than the Reform. It rejects the Talmud. Judaism is continually developing, but they really even reject some of the basic ethical, not that they reject ethics, but they Judaism and Reconstructionism looks faintly like a atheist Judaism, in the sense that there's no specific one God. God is in everything, and so they sort of reject the idea of a deity. If by that you mean a God in the heaven who exists somehow separately from the rest of us. So it is, in many ways, practicing the ethics. So I don't want to say they're not ethical, practicing the culture and ethics of Judaism. So, and then without a deity. But finally, then cultural secular is exactly it. There are a lot of people who are Jews by birth and culture. So, just like our Easter and Christmas Christians, you'll get, Hanukkah and Passover Jews, or even Jews who have no connection to their Judaism except for perhaps their Ashkenazi roots or Sephardic roots in terms of culture, language, food, and things like that. And so that is the end of this section on the history and the literature, because Judaism is a people of books and writings. And so the next presentation will be on the belief system in Judaism.